Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be discussing Yemen, both the enraging fact that the Biden administration seems to have lied to us and is honestly pursuing almost exactly the same policy towards Yemen that the Trump administration did. But also, I want to talk a little bit about Yemen, and most of what we're going to be doing today is just sort of reviewing just how grim the situation in Yemen is and how deeply involved the United States is without actually having troops on the ground. I think this is an important and kind of terrifying model to look at, especially as we consider, this sort of two-front thing that's been happening. In Afghanistan, where we actually had some troops still on the ground, we're getting out, we're pulling back. Whereas in Yemen, we seem to be just sort of doubling down. This horrific horror show in Yemen is something that is actually a very little cost to U.S. political actors, unless you've got the media trying to go after a figure as they were with Donald Trump. So I think what's happening in Yemen right now is sort of an interesting, and what's been happening for 5 or 6 years, is I think an interesting harbinger of the future. We've seen in recent months escalating instability in the whole Sahel and into the Horn of Africa, whether we're talking about the death of the president of Chad, whether we're talking about yet another coup in Mali, whether we're talking about Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's failed attempt depends on who you're talking to, but quite possibly failed attempt at using genocide to unify Ethiopia. I see all of this arc, and I see a lot of places where the United States and its Gulf allies could use exactly the playbook that they've been using in Yemen for the past 5 or 6 years. And I think the fact that the Biden administration is just, at this point, seems to be just continuing what's happening in Yemen and seems to be getting away with it almost entirely, is a really troubling indicator for the future of U.S. involvement and just war in North Africa and the Middle East going forward. So that's a lot to cover today. These live chats are rarely super fun, but this is certainly going to be among the darker topics. Let me know if you have trouble hearing me. I'll turn off the air conditioner, which is rather loud, but that would also make me melt. So yeah, I hope I don't have to do that. Some preliminary stuff. The way we do this is I do like a 45-minute presentation. I'm going to go through the stuff that I just talked about. And then after that, we have question and answer period. If you want to do super chats, that guarantees that I will answer your question. I also do other questions. If you have any super chats, please hold off until we get to the Q&A period. Also, moderation. You can say anything you want about me and about the ideas that I'm expressing. We are very open-minded here at the More Freedom Foundation. Nobody gets blocked for expressing opinions here. What you can get blocked for is attacking people other than me in the chat. If you are going after other people in the chat needlessly, aggressively, if you're just disrupting the chat, then you will be blocked. Logo Cool Extreme is the moderator. There is no court of appeal from the court of Loga. He decides what goes and what does not. He'll warn you once if you're acting out inappropriately, and if you don't listen to him, he will block you, and that is what it is. So listen to Loga. Hold off on super chats until the Q&A period. Definitely, if you have questions, ask them again in the Q&A period, because I don't have the mental bandwidth to follow what's going on in the live chat. So without further ado, so Biden lied to us. We're now past the point where we can say, oh, well, it's early days and they're figuring out their new policy. We don't know. Well, Biden has been in power for 6 months now, and almost nothing has changed in Yemen. This is a really, really key point to emphasize. The war in Yemen is something that the United States can end tomorrow. Let me rephrase that. There will continue to be fighting in Yemen. There will probably continue to be fighting in Yemen for years to come. But what the United States can do tomorrow is take the foreign element out of it almost entirely. There's a concerted effort to portray what's going on in Yemen as a sort of more balanced proxy war. Like what's going on in Syria is, in fact, a pretty balanced proxy war. Without Iran and Hezbollah, Assad would not have survived. That's for sure. That is not the case in Yemen. The Iranians do have sort of a slight rooting interest for the Houthis, the guys who won the war in Yemen back in 2015 and have continued to be winning the war in Yemen against the Saudis. Since the Saudi invasion in 2015, the Houthis have begun to take more and more money and weapons from Iran, but this is not this is something that the invasion has accelerated. The invasion has given Iran deeper connections in Yemen. The Saudi invasion has given Iran deeper connections in Yemen, mostly just because it's a really easy opportunity for both the Iranians and the Houthis. The Saudi invasion created a in-depth Iranian exposure. And even to date, experts vary. Obviously, Iran isn't publishing figures. And also, people don't really want a serious examination of these figures, which I'm sure the U.S. intelligence community would be capable of, because the sense is that it indicates that while the Iranians are probably pouring, $10 million a month into the conflict in Yemen, the Saudis are pouring somewhere along the lines of $5 billion a month. That's probably, those numbers are not accurate, but those numbers are a good indication of the mismatch in the amount of funding and seriousness here. The Saudis are doing a full-throated invasion, have large-scale mercenary forces that they pay for, have the support of the United States and the United Kingdom in maintaining a horrific embargo on the Yemeni airports and ports. Saudi Arabia is doing the majority of the death dealing. If Saudi Arabia were taken out of the equation, would Yemen be a happy, peaceful place? No, Yemen was never a happy, peaceful place. A lot of that is due to U.S. involvement, but a lot of it is just due to the infelicities of being a poor country with a very rich neighbor in Saudi Arabia. It's a place that's going to be unstable, but the majority of the death dealing, the majority of the horror of the Yemeni conflict stems from the Saudi invasion and the Saudi embargo. What's important to emphasize, and I think this is one of the tremendous myths. Actually, before I get to them, one of the tremendous myths is that the United States can end this Saudi involvement tomorrow. And what I'm so angry about at the Biden administration is that Joe Biden essentially promised to do that on February 4th, 2021, just two weeks into his administration. He said that all American support for Saudi Arabia's offensive operations in Yemen was finished. Now, of course, there's a lot of wiggle room there. What do you consider offensive operations by Saudi Arabia? There's some wiggle room there. And even at the time, there's some wiggle room that I endorsed there, because in order to get the Saudis to pull back, the Saudis have created this problem. They've invaded Yemen, and they have gotten it to the point where, because they're so fucking bad at military operations, that's an important thing to emphasize, that Saudi Arabia has a terrible military that is really bad at things and is also the second or third most expensive military on the planet. It's a tragedy because Saudi Arabia is so bad at this. Their supposedly 2-month policing action in Yemen has extended for 6 years and has ended up with large-scale attacks against the Saudi state from the place that they're invading. So they went in to beat up a militia, and that militia is now carrying out serious attacks against the Saudi state. So to extricate the Saudis from this insanely stupid situation they put themselves into, there does need to be some commitment from the United States. Yeah, we're gonna make sure that the Houthis, this little ragtag militia group you were going to beat up, can no longer bomb your major cities and is no longer seriously threatening to take Saudi territory. That's how useless the Saudi military is. The fact that this militia, this Houthi militia that can't control its own ports, is able to bomb Saudi Arabian installations, is able to attempt to at least bomb Riyadh. I don't know how serious those missile attacks are, and is in serious danger of taking Saudi territory. So when in February 4th, when Biden says, we're going to stop supporting Saudi offensive operations, saying that we're going to defend the integrity of the Saudi state, was the implication. That I could agree with. I think it's necessary to get Saudi Arabia to stop its horrific campaign of murder, destruction, and famine in Yemen. You do need to protect the integrity of the Saudi state. So I supported that and said, okay, well, that's one way you could interpret this. 5 months after that statement, almost 6 months after that statement, February 4th, what's clear now is that what the Biden administration means by support for offensive operations, it was going to end, is or rather implying that, what the Biden administration meant by we're going to continue supporting Saudi Arabia's defensive operations wasn't just defending Saudi soil, it is defending absolutely everything that Saudi Arabia is doing. So the Biden administration has no intention of changing anything in Yemen. That's what's become clear to me right now. Maybe that's not true. Maybe next week, they will begin to take the steps that they should have been taking 6 months ago. But I don't think that is a priority for the Biden administration. I think the Biden administration has screwed us here. And it's basically doing exactly what the Trump administration was doing in Yemen. It's not quite as disgusting about it. It's not quite as sleazy about it as the Trump administration was, but it's doing the exact same thing. And the more you think about it, the more I look at it, the reason the Trump administration had to do sleazy, disgusting, obvious things to defend the ongoing U.S. participation in the war in Yemen is because the Democratic Congress was pushing so hard against him. Because, especially after the Saudi Arabian murder of a Washington Post contributor in October of 2018, the sort of U.S. establishment, Democratic, journalistic, media, whatever, decided all of a sudden that what was happening in Yemen was the horror that it absolutely was. So they started going after, the Congress started going after Trump on this. I think we had 2 passages of war powers resolutions, something, the minutiae of which I won't get into, but are a very big deal. And basically, Trump had to ignore those resolutions, quite plausibly unconstitutionally, though I don't want to get into that, and just outright lie to preserve the project in Yemen. Biden doesn't need to lie to preserve the project in Yemen because all of the media, all of the Democratic Congress people have just forgotten that Yemen is a horror show. And it truly, truly is. The country is being starved. I don't think anybody who's listening to this needs to hear this again, but over the past 5 or 6 years, we don't know how many people have been killed by this. Syria is a place where we have rough estimates that, 500,000 people have been killed. But Syria is a place that had a lot of educated, literate people. It was at a certain level of wealth where everybody had a cell phone. So you had citizen journalism. Yemen ain't there. There's certainly a class of people that have cell phones and wealth and literacy in Yemen, but it is not the majority. We honestly have no idea how many people have been killed in Yemen. The estimates are in the hundreds of thousands, but these are just guesses. These are just complete estimates based on so much less than we have in the Syrian conflict. So I think it's entirely possible that 500,000 Yemenis have died. It's impossible. It's possible. It's probably unlikely that 1 million Yemenis have died over the course of this horrific Saudi invasion, but it's possible. We just don't know. The embargo has led to starvation. Maybe starvation is not the right word, but widespread famine, malnutrition. This has led to diseases like cholera, cutting a swath through the country, and that's before we even consider what COVID-19 has done. Folks will point out that the Houthis absolutely corral humanitarian aid for their own purposes, and their fighters, get the lion's share of what they need, and the 70% of Yemeni people under their power starve. Yeah, that's true. That's sort of standard rebel shit. But it is Saudi Arabia, with the support of the United States and the United Kingdom, that is creating the humanitarian situation. Yeah, the Houthis could be managing it in a more humanitarian or decent way, for sure, no question. But the evil situation is created by the actors in this situation that have real power. That is Saudi Arabia, that is the United States, that is the United Kingdom. Yeah, so you've got ports, and you have Saudi Arabia, the United States, the United Kingdom limiting what is coming into those ports. And then, of course, on the other end of that, the Houthis that control those ports are taking more for their own benefit than they would than they should. No question. But the problem, the reason there is scarcity in Yemen is because Saudi Arabia invaded in 2015 and shut down the ability to transport food, fuel, and other crucial elements into Yemen. Importantly, no, there has not been entire shutdown of these things. There's still humanitarian stuff. There's still some transit that is allowed. There was a point after the Houthis blew up one of the Saudi oil installations that Houthi, Iranian, what have you. There was a point at which Saudi Arabia really did shut down absolutely everything. And the Trump administration had to be like, whoa, you cannot starve an entire freaking country to death. But that's where the line is. Like we're gonna allow you to starve the country in minor ways, but you can't get to the point where like literally 30 million people are gonna die, which is what Saudi Arabia wanted to do. So I mean, it's not like it's a complete like embargo and shutdown, but it is a heavy limitation of what can be shipped into the territories where the vast majority of Yemenis live. So like I go over and over, like I am not someone who's going to tell you that the Houthis are good people. They're not good people. They're terrible people. This is the Houthis, the Yemeni government. They're bad people, but they are bad people who are becoming worse because of a foreign invasion. That is what we are dealing with here. This foreign invasion came about because of an Obama administration policy. Sure, the Obama administration was lied to by the Saudis, but they should have known better. The Houthis were an ongoing insurgency that I believe was it 04 or 01, started with a successful assassination of the Houthi leader, which started I think that's a really important thing about drone war. That's an important point here. The Houthi movement and takeover of the Yemeni country started with the successful assassination of its leader. That's a really key thing to remember here. In when you've got the U.S. government who's telling you that assassinating leaders is the way to go about things. Actually, I need to just make a video about that. The Houthi rise to power started with the assassination of its leader. And over the course of the 2000s, the first decade of this century, Saleh, the guy who was in charge at the time, went in massively over and over again. And by 2009, with direct Saudi intervention support, and every single attempt to go into northern Yemen and crush the Houthis made them more powerful. So when MBS and the Saudi government came to the Obama administration in 2015 and said, we're going to take 3 months to stamp out the Houthis, the Obama administration, or at least people in the U.S. government, should have frickin' known there was no way that was going to happen. I think there's a lot of exonerating Obama by saying, well, you know, the Saudis just told us this was going to be a 3-month thing. And, well, it's a 6-year thing. And anybody who knew anything about the situation in northern Yemen should have known that it wasn't going to be a 3-month thing. By the end of the Obama administration, apparently there were some signs of remorse, some attempts to dial back on weapons sales, but that was all sort of more in theory than in practice. What's an important thing to do here, and an important thing to, and I think this is a key part of something we're going to see more and more in the future. The reason that Saudi Arabia was allowed to invade Yemen was because the Obama administration wanted to do something that I support very heavily, which is the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. I think that's a very good thing. I think that's a way to actually get the United States out of the region, which I support very heavily. But this was a terrible, terrible deal because this Obama administration choice has led to the deaths of tens, if not hundreds, or maybe even hundreds of thousands, or maybe even as many as a million Yemenis. This sort of horrific choice to let Saudi Arabia do this. And again, it's really key. There's certain like marquee things that we no longer do, like U.S. Air Force no longer refuels the Saudi jets that go to blow up Yemeni school buses. It was actually, in fact, in the aftermath of a Saudi jet blowing up a Yemeni school bus and killing 50 people that the U.S. Air Force stopped directly refueling these Saudi jets. But when those Saudi jets land in Saudi Arabia, it is still U.S. government or U.S. contractor personnel that maintain these planes, that keep these planes in working order, that train the Saudi pilots. We're now 5 or 6 years in, so there are new classes of Saudi pilots that have been trained by the United States to fly these planes that are carrying out this horrific invasion of Saudi Arabia's poor neighbor, Yemen. This is something that we are deeply involved in and that Joe Biden could stop at any time. Obama is also given too much credit for attempting to stop things at the end of his administration after watching a year and a half of after watching about a year and change of horror unfold in Yemen. He tried to dial back on weapons sales a little bit, but that's always, I think he's given way too much credit for that, because as we're seeing in the Biden administration, you can make an announcement like that, which Biden did at the beginning. He said, oh, we're going to reevaluate all our sales to Saudi Arabia and its little buddy, the United Arab Emirates, who is helping to destroy Yemen. We're going to reevaluate those sales. That was in February. By April, it was announced there was another $24 billion sale of weapons to the UAE. And, the Saudis, I don't think there's been a big headline sale to the Saudis yet, but that's probably because they just don't need weapons yet. I'm quite sure, especially given the high pitch of anti-Saudi rhetoric that we were getting before Biden was elected. I'm sure that Saudi Arabia made a point of stocking up on the missiles and bombs that they needed. But by the time they actually do need more missiles, probably within the next 3 months or so, I would expect the Biden administration to just sell them to them, because there's the up in the airness of like, oh, we're going to think more seriously. This was supposedly Obama's big saving grace after seeing the horror in Yemen for a year, towards the end of his administration. We're going to start thinking more seriously about these weapons sales. And yeah, Biden was going to start off this year thinking more seriously about these weapons sales. And now the weapons sales are going forward. When Donald Trump came to power, he stopped the hemming and hawing. He stopped the bullshit. He doubled down. He basically was like, Saudi Arabia can do whatever it wants, despite, of course, he was also complaining about Saudi Arabia on the campaign trail, as was Biden. What happened that was interesting, and I think is probably it was very heartening, and is now very disheartening that it's disappeared, was that with Yemen, you could finally see for the first time probably since the 1980s and certain U.S. actions in Central America, you could really see the horror of something breaking through into the U.S. media, the horror of something that the United States was doing. And that was fantastic. I think my first video on this, I just reposted on the community tab on the YouTube channel, was in probably the fall of 2017. I was talking about the horror that was going on in Yemen and how we were encouraging it, letting it happen, or what have you. And that was sort of a minority thing. By the fall of 2018, and after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, U.S.-Saudi Arabia relationships and the war in Yemen became a big news topic because MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, what have you. Not that it ever became as big a topic as it should have been, but you would see reports show up. You would see real reporting going on. In the links in the description, I've got examples of real reporting The New York Times pointing out that actually most of the, not most of, but a significant chunk of the Saudi forces fighting in Yemen were Sudanese child soldiers. That's something we never would have known if the New York Times hadn't decided to go to war against Donald Trump. BuzzFeed had a great article talking about how the UAE wasn't just using U.S. mercenaries to do terrible stuff. The U.S. mercenaries was using, the UAE was using U.S. mercenaries to kill Yemeni politicians supposedly on their own side. Sorry, using U.S. mercenaries to kill Yemeni politicians that were supposedly on their own side. We had the Associated Press that pointed out that, this is also in the link below, that the United States and Saudi Arabia are basically allied with Al Qaeda in Yemen. I'm sorry if I seem tired about all this, but what the point is that there was real reporting being done about this. There was a real constituency that was willing to look at this war and be like, what the hell are we doing? It's not that we're allowing this to happen. That's key. It's not that we're allowing this to happen. We are facilitating this. We are making this happen. Without the U.S. government, there is no way that Saudi Arabia and the UAE could do what they are doing. I mean, just fundamentally, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have no security, have no national security outside of the context of the United States. The UAE famously fields a slightly more creditable military force than Saudi Arabia does. However, neither of these things have any independent neither of these countries have any independent existence of the United States. If the United States said, you know what, screw it, we're out of the Middle East entirely, that's not even something that I would advocate. Like, I want all U.S. troops out. I want U.S. involvement in ongoing wars to stop. But I don't want the United States to be completely out. I think the United States, there is a reason for the United States to guarantee the borders of the Middle East, as it did for Kuwait in 1991, as I think it does make sense for them to continue to guarantee the borders of Saudi Arabia and UAE. However, my point is that Saudi Arabia and UAE need the United States to guarantee its borders. If the United States simply said, we continue to guarantee your borders, now get the fuck out of Yemen or we'll stop, that would be the end of foreign involvement in the Yemen war. And yes, the Houthis, who are ugly guys, would win. They would win, but the thing is, they won back in 2015. They won complete control of the country. And because the Obama administration wanted to get complete control, might slightly overstate it, but they got everything in Yemen that was worthwhile. I'm sorry, Hadramaut is lovely. There's lovely, beautiful desert oases in Al Hadramaut and Mara and what have you. They're worthwhile places. Nobody fucking lives there. The Houthis had taken the capital, which they still hold, and were, I can't recall if they had completely taken or were on the verge of taking Aden, the large southern city. It was over. They had won, and because the Obama administration wanted to make Saudi Arabia feel better about the Iran nuclear deal, we gave them the ability to do this. That was a bad thing to do. Anyway, so what is the point of the United States in Yemen? There are some stories that are bullshit. What we're really there to do is we're there to spin money. We're there for the same reason that, that the slimy limeys are there. We're there for the same reason that the truly amoral United Kingdom is, just to make money, just to sell our weapons, just to continue to sell our weapons to these Gulf states. It's the only reason we're there. I've got a video. Mike Pompeo made that very clear a couple years back. I made a video talking about that directly. We're there to make money. We're there to sell weapons. This is something that is tremendously important to U.S. Congress people. I've run videos about that, the military-industrial complex. It's not that U.S. weapons is that big a slice of the U.S. economy. It's really not. It's surprising, actually. If you look at, you add up all these Boeing, Raytheons, this, that, and the other thing, and if you add in other government contracts and oil companies, you can get to 5-10% of the US economy or something like that, but you really have to try. It's not that defense companies are a huge slice of the US economy, it's that defense companies own Congress people, because the defense industry is not a private industry. It is a industry that's exclusively sells to the government. So this 5% of the economy or even less is this incredibly incestuous thing. For most things in the economy, the government's not supposed to be involved in it. It's actually, it's seen as corruption. It's seen as anti-competitive. The government's not supposed to be picking winners and whatnot. In defense, they're supposed to be picking winners. That's sort of how it's supposed to work for national security reasons. That's, you don't want weapons technology to be completely in the free market. And this means that Congress people have really gross interlinked relationships with defense companies. So defense companies have this extraordinary power over our foreign policy, which honestly nobody in the United States really gives a shit about. There's only certain stories like the Islamic State or 9/11 obviously that take on a life of their own and get actual constituencies of American citizens that give a shit about foreign policy. Mostly our foreign policy is owned by defense companies. And defense companies want to sell stuff. So they want to blow shit up. So they want people to die. That's what they're there for. That's their business. And Yemen provides that. Saudi Arabia the fact that Saudi Arabia is a terrible, useless military that just constantly churns through billions of dollars of weapons without ever achieving anything is awesome from the U.S. government, not the U.S. government's official perspective, but from the perspective of U.S. Congress people. So what is going on with the United States and Yemen is that the United States wants to keep selling weapons. And what's interesting here, this is sort of the sign of the future, because we've gotten our military out of it. One of the main reasons that U.S. foreign policy becomes a problem for Congress people is if U.S. soldiers die. There's a lot of talk about, it's the all-volunteer force, all-volunteer military. That makes it easier for folks to do things, for Congress to get away with doing stupid stuff than if, the U.S. still had the draft where everyone was conscripted. That's true, but imagine what defense companies and Congress people and the U.S. government could get away with if there weren't any U.S. soldiers at all. And that's the future that I see in Yemen. Yemen is an incredible money spinner for the U.S. government. And it doesn't matter that it's killing hundreds of thousands of some of the poorest people in the world, because the U.S. media doesn't have the ability to pay attention anymore. And it was this sort of magic moment when Trump came to power and there was enough investment from political figures across the spectrum and from the media to point out, oh, this is an evil thing that we can blame on Trump. And that's why we got so much good reporting on the horror that is the Saudi invasion of Yemen. There's some standard stories of what we're doing there, fighting terror, right? One of the reasons that Yemen did eventually become this happy hunting ground for U.S. defense companies is because the United States has been bombing it regularly. I don't know if it's since 2001, but certainly for quite some time. I got a super chat from Nikhil Auto says, how can we ever end the MIC? We can't, right? Contraction in funding doesn't seem to be in the cards. The world suffers. What do we do? I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question, Nikhil. I don't know. It's funny. I had this thought that I was like, I was actually about to run a video in early 2020. I was writing this video. Sorry, can you hear me over the siren? I was writing this video talking about actually, Medicare is going to kill the U.S. military industrial complex, because at some point we're going to get to this point where, the U.S. government stops being able to print money. And if the U.S. government stops being able to print money, and we've got like hyperinflation or whatnot, well, obviously the U.S. government's going to go for stuff that U.S. citizens actually care about, like Medicare, and like the military funding is just going to disappear and evaporate. And then in 2020, COVID happened, and it became clear that the United States has vastly more ability to print money than we thought. So even that, I don't know. Like I thought, like, yeah, we're going to hit a budget crisis and U.S. military is going to go away and make the U.S. safer. But that's not going to happen either. So, man, I have no idea. But let me finish the presentation before there are any more super chats. Thank you so much, Nikhil. Let's see. Spend money. Okay, so we're not there to fight terror. It was our fighting terror that helped to destabilize Yemen in the first place. To be clear, it's not just our bombing Yemen nearly indiscriminately for a decade that caused Yemen to destabilize. Yemen had a lot of its own problems, including its long-term dictator Saleh. It's a place that sort of very likely to fall apart. But yes, U.S. bombing contributed to that. And as the Associated Press report that I linked in the description points out, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Yemen. Yeah, we do still bomb the occasional Al-Qaeda operative, for sure. Our allies in the Saudi coalition occasionally carry out stuff against the Al-Qaeda fighters. But Al-Qaeda fighters hate the Houthis a lot more than they hate us or the Saudis. So, we're sort of de facto working with them. If the Houthis were allowed to take over all of Yemen, Al-Qaeda would be, as they mostly already had in 2014, there would be no Al-Qaeda. There's no Al-Qaeda in Houthi-controlled regions because the Houthis are committed to actually fighting the people who did 9/11, Like the Houthis are actually committed to fighting the terrorists that blew up Lower Manhattan. The United States is happy, the United States government and our defense companies are happy to ally with Al-Qaeda quite openly in Syria, a little more give and take. Sometimes we are actually bombing Al-Qaeda people in Yemen, but we're mostly working with them. So yeah, we're not in Yemen to fight terror. We're in Yemen to work with Al-Qaeda and Sunni extremists against the Houthis. The genesis of the Houthis is an indigenous group of Yemeni folks. I don't want to oversell their virtue. They are somewhat, they're from a class of people who used to run Yemen. So they're sort of like a dispossessed elite. I don't want to make them seem like they're, heroic Viet Cong or anything. They are actually, they are the old leaders of Yemen, like for 1,000 years. But what the Saudis were doing is they were coming in and building Wahhabi madrasas, the evil Saudi Arabian Islam that is behind, 9/11, the Islamic State, the bad, extreme, evil kind of Islam. The Saudis were pumping that into Yemen. That's where the genesis of the Houthis is as a reaction to that. So there is nothing the Houthis hate more than Al-Qaeda. And we are doing our damnedest to keep the Houthis from taking over Yemen and crushing Al-Qaeda. So yeah, we're de facto allied. So it's not about fighting terrorism. It's not really about fighting Iran either. Yes, the Houthis are aligned with Iran. Yes, as the conflict has worn on, the Iranians have profited by the idiocy of the Saudis for getting involved in Yemen to this extent. The Iranians are providing some missile technology to the Houthis. And let me be clear about the Iranians supporting the Houthis with missile technology. Good. They are the good guys in this conflict. Because as bad as the Houthis are, they are an indigenous Yemeni group that is fighting against outside invaders. Whether you are talking about the Viet Cong, whether you are talking about the U.S. Founding fathers, the people who fight for their country sometimes do nasty shit. The fact that, all of English-speaking Canada was initially populated by refugees who wanted to stay loyal to the king from the United States is something we don't talk about. Like, revolutionaries are nasty people who do nasty things. I would like the Houthis to be less nasty for sure, but the Houthis are an indigenous movement fighting against a foreign invader. Those are just the facts of the matter. The laughable, internationally supported Yemeni government, as we're still obligated to call them. And they are officially internationally supported because Obama gave the Saudis a UN Security Council resolution saying that the Houthis were evil and they had to give up on all this territory they had conquered. This government, I'm not sure if Hadi was ever elected, but he was in a 2-year term that would have ended in 2014? And he resigned, I think, after when he was supposed to resign anyway, when the Houthis forced him out of the country. He does not control anything other than Marib, which is a sort of, I think it's already kind of into the desert sort of oasis, which is the reason that the Houthis have had so much trouble taking it. He does not control anything in the south. The south, which is not controlled by the Houthis, is controlled by the Southern Transition Council, which is a more UAE-backed group that wants to secede from Yemen entirely. There were brief periods when Hadi attempted to run his government from Aden, and he was chased out. The internationally recognized president of Yemen has spent almost the entirety of this conflict living in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. It's really incredibly depressing to watch these big lies about Yemen come back, because that's what's been happening. During the Trump administration, when people were like, oh, this is a horrible thing that is happening that Trump is doing, people started speaking honestly about these things. You would read things in the New York Times that would point out, well, yeah, Hadi, he hasn't been in Yemen for 7 years. How the hell is he in charge of an internationally recognized government? Now you don't see that so much anymore. There was an article on War on the Rocks that I linked below that's by an Obama administration appointee who's just like blithely putting forward 2015's argument in favor of letting the Saudis do this. It's real. That was the thing that really convinced me to make this, I apologize, too angry video, is like, you read that War on the Rocks thing from a former ambassador in the Obama administration. And it's just like, it's like nothing happened. It's like we learned nothing. It's like, oh, damn those Houthis, look at them unfairly taking over the country. They took over the country 6 fucking years ago. We have poured billions of dollars into trying to dislodge them, and we have failed. We have failed utterly. The only reason to continue this at this point is to keep the money train spinning, to keep the blood flowing and the money flowing to Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed. Is it Lockheed Martin still a thing, or did it get eaten up? It is so infuriating and so profoundly sad to watch media apparatus that was briefly honest about a horror that was being carried out by our government in alliance with the Saudis go back to lying about it because Biden's in charge. And it's not like they have to. It's not like these stories are telling outright lies. There are things that you can say that are true. Like, actually, yet this is the internationally recognized government. This is, according to the UN Security Council, which a resolution that the U.S. Got its allies on board with, and the Saudis bought everybody else who would have objected. According to that, the Houthis are supposed to give up their weapons. The Houthis are supposed to go back to a little corner in the north of Yemen before we're going to allow Yemenis to eat. That's the official United Nations position. That's insane. The Yemenis haven't been in that little corner in northern Yemen since like 2006. It is a not just an attempt by outside invading powers to change the politics of Yemen. It is a spectacularly failed attempt that we should stop fucking attempting. Anyway, so yeah, we're not there for other big lies. The U.S. is not connected. That's simply not true. We are deeply, deeply connected. None of this would be possible without us. We are not just providing, I think there was some news that we were providing actual special forces to help defend the Saudi border. We are providing ongoing maintenance for the planes that kill the Yemeni children. We are providing intelligence to those Yemeni bombers that are killing the Saudi bombers that are killing the Yemeni children. Like if the U.S. wanted to stop this, seriously, we could stop it tomorrow. But we do not want to stop this because we want to continue, because our Congress people and our generals who want to go work for defense companies want to continue selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Another myth is that the Houthis are not winning. The Houthis are definitely winning. What is of issue this month is that these months is what the Biden administration will say is, well, the Houthis were given a ceasefire offer and they're not taking it. Well, yes, the ceasefire offer was, as with every other negotiation, predicated on that bullshit UN resolution. The Houthis have won the war. They currently have Marib besieged. They've had Marib besieged for years now at this point. I think the current offensive supposedly started up about a year ago. It does seem like this Houthi offensive seems to be failing, mostly because they are up against the entire power of the Saudi and U.S. governments. But if the Houthis were to take Marib, the war would be over. Yemen is it's sort of this like this. There's you've got a place where everybody lives, and then you've got sort of Marib, which is at the edge of this massive desert, and then you've got the rest of the country, which looks rather large, but is mostly desert, a few oases, and some people trailed along the coast. If Marib is taken, then the internationally recognized government has almost no real position in Yemen anymore at all. So in that article in War on the Rocks, the sort of official Obama-Biden position, talks about the Houthis as if, this thing for Marib, and it's a big deal, and the Houthis, they're turning down ceasefires. Like, the Houthis have won the war. They had won the war back in 2014, and they are at the point where they are about to win the war again. Saudi ceasefire offers that demand that the Houthis give up. I think specifically at issue, I don't think anybody's stupid enough to claim that the Houthis can, are going to give up territory, like give up the capital of the country. They might lift their siege of Marib and allow that to continue. But what the Saudis included in their offer was like, sure, will you end this siege of Marib, and we'll open the port at Hodeidah and, the airport, but you have to share the revenues from that port with this internationally recognized government based in Saudi Arabia's capital. I mean, they are not serious offers that are being made here. Should the Houthis, give up on their siege of Marib? Well, it seems like it's not they've been doing it for a couple of years now. They've been doing it very seriously at the cost of a lot of resources and fighters for a year now. So, yeah, I think they probably should stop trying to take Marib. And, yeah, it'd be nice if the Houthis were, more amenable to letting the war end. That'd be great. But it's also just a ridiculous thing to ask. It's, as I suppose the U.S. government did at the time, it's like asking, why isn't the North Vietnamese, why aren't they nicer to the South Vietnamese? It's like, because they fucking lost. And the only thing keeping this war going is the Saudis, the UAE, the United States, the United Kingdom, continuing to pour billions of dollars. It's the Saudis and the UAEs pouring in billions of dollars, and it's U.S. military equipment, resources, and maintenance staff that are just building this tidal wave of Yemeni blood to no purpose. Internationally recognized government, okay, got that. UN supported, not actually lying. Okay, got that. Just briefly, Biden made this promise February 4th. We're going to pull back. They're not doing a goddamn thing. We got very excited because in the sort of closing bits of the Trump administration, I think literally in the last week or two, The Trump administration declared the Houthis, the government of most of Yemen, to be a foreign terrorist organization. This is not a state sponsor of terror, which I guess you could have just designated them fairly or unfairly. This is a foreign terror organization, which is an extremely weird step to take, which basically would mean that nobody, no humanitarian group, no businessman selling food would be allowed to provide anything, any interaction or economic engagement with the government of 70 to 80% of the Yemeni people. So that's like 20 million people, 25 million people, not doing the math, that were forbidden by the Trump administration from eating. It was very exciting that the Biden administration backed off of that very quickly, and more quickly, honestly, than I think myself or many others expected, because they acknowledged that basic reality that, like, hey, like, yeah, we can't starve, which the Trump administration, forced the Saudis to acknowledge at one point. Yeah, we can't actually starve 25 million people to death just to sell weapons. That's not something we can do. And the Biden administration backed off of that, and that's great. And they appointed a Yemen envoy, and it seemed like they were very serious. 6 months later, it's appallingly clear that they are not serious about ending the war in Yemen in the slightest, and that is a goddamn tragedy. To close, I just want to say, like, this is the model going forward. Like, this is how U.S. congresspeople and U.S. defense contractors can have their cake and not have to eat anything, by working with awful actors like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And really, honestly, that's all it's going to take. Because the Saudi Arabian UAE, they're going to continue. The last thing they're going to have money for is going to be U.S. weapons, because they know that's the guarantee of their security. Not that they use those weapons for anything useful, but because if they continue to buy weapons, then the United States is going to continue to protect them from people who are more powerful than them. That not just includes Iran and Turkey, but apparently includes the Houthi fucking militia, is a more dangerous and intimidating entity than the entire military of Saudi Arabia and the entire military of UAE, which is a pretty horrifically humbling thing to acknowledge. But yeah, with just the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the United States can continue to enrich itself off of the death and destruction of the Middle East and North Africa. I think in the Middle East, we tend to pay attention. Syria, I think, became a little bit of an awkward embarrassment, because it was pretty obvious that the folks we were supporting were basically Al-Qaeda. It was kind of hard to ignore. In Yemen, it's easier to ignore, because, there aren't a lot of Yemenis who, have the wherewithal to do the citizen journalism. There aren't a lot of Yemenis. There are actually a lot of Yemenis who have connections to the United States. Like, most bodegas in New York City, at least my parts of New York City, seem to be run by Yemenis, actually. But it's just not at the same level that sort of Syrian connections were. And as we get into North Africa, we're already seeing in the Sahel just how anonymous this stuff can be. How the Saudis or the UAE can pick a side in some war. Certainly saw it in Libya. The real terror for me is I do think, and I've mocked this, I sort of mocked the idea of, like, Ethiopia's grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam becoming a problem, because I couldn't really envision Egypt being able to, invade Ethiopia and stop that dam. But now Ethiopia is destabilized to the point where Egypt doesn't have to invade, it just sort of has to bomb it, and Ethiopia will fall apart. So if you've got Ethiopia, this is a country of 100 million, falling apart, that also destabilizes Somalia, which, scrambling its way back to the beginnings of some kind of stability, has the potential to destabilize, other countries, happier, healthier countries going down the coast of Africa, sort of Kenya, Uganda, what have you. So I could really see this Yemen model being imported to Africa on a large scale. We've already seen aspects of this working in Somalia and Libya for sure. But yeah, I mean, it's all kind of vague and deniable there aren't really any serious U.S. forces on the ground. There are certainly special forces, but they get in, they get out. When one of them dies here or there, maybe there's a news cycle, maybe there isn't. You've got all kinds of military contractors. I mean, we were talking at the last patrons only news chat about Eric Prince at some length and just how gross it is that we have like Renaissance style mercenary princes now. This thing that we've got going in Yemen, on one level, you've got this sort of fig leaf of a UN Security Council resolution that says, "Oh, we're going to go after some bad guys." I could see exactly that developing across this entire swath of sub-Saharan Africa, and just being a money spinner for U.S. defense companies for the entire coming decade. I could definitely see that happening. I think the Yemen model has a serious danger of taking over, sort of mid-African politics for the next decade. And we really need to not let that happen. That really needs to not happen because the costs will be millions of lives. We've already had a lost economic decade in the Sahel, in the range of countries directly under the Sahara Desert, because of U.S. military intervention. I think there's a distinct possibility that we could lose another decade to that, especially if the Yemen model spreads. So that's grim, huh? I think that was just about an hour. I feel like that was a little less organized and a little angrier than I like to make these presentations, but it is something you should be angry about. I hope you're as angry about what the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are doing to Yemen as I am. It's a goddamn tragedy. That's what I have to say about that. Scott Locks has a super chat. Thank you so much. And a question. Everywhere Iranian proxies fight, they win. Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. Doesn't this make the U.S. invading Iran unlikely? Not really. I mean, well, I have said I don't think there's any chance of the United States with U.S. troops invading Iran. I think that ship has sailed. Like there maybe in a fit of overconfidence in 2004, maybe that was possible. But after much less organized, much less serious conquest in Iraq blew up in our faces, the chances of an actual U.S. troops on the ground amphibious invasion of Iran, it's just not going to happen. Like we can't even in the new context of spending unlimited money on everything, we simply can't afford it. So that's not going to happen. Everywhere Iranian proxies fight, they win. Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. Doesn't this make the U.S. invading Iran unlikely? I think the fundamental lack of seriousness of Iranian opponents is something that's pretty key here. Like Saudi Arabia and a bunch of dumbass, shitheads, video game playing Europeans with pretensions of glory, Islamic State idiocy. I mean, like Iran, Iran in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon has won by backing better forces, by backing more coherent, more intelligent, more honestly, just better, just entities with better rationales. The official Syrian government that is in control for decades and actually has new legitimacy because it's defending, women who want to work and, just defending basic modernity in his country. Like that's a good horse to back. The Houthis, a group of indigenous rebel fighters sparked by Saudi imperialism over the course of decades, that also happened to be from the 1,000-year ruling class of Yemen. That's a really good horse to back. I mean, Iran's sort of capacity and brilliance can be really overstated because they just back the right horse. It's not a question of Iran being so awesome at stuff. It's just that we're so fucking stupid. It's not like, well, I'm not well, certainly the Saudis are so fucking stupid, But the U.S. goal isn't to win in any of these places. The U.S. goal is to sell weapons. It has been a tremendously successful. If you look at the Middle East, you see a horror show where the U.S. has embarrassed itself. But from the context of U.S. generals, U.S. defense contractors, U.S. Congress people who get money from these entities, it's been an amazing decade. It's been awesome. Are you kidding me? The Islamic State was phenomenal for them. So yeah, like if the U.S. were actually interested in peace and prosperity in these places, then we'd actually do things that foster it. We don't. We sort of give money to radicals and sell weapons to anybody we can. That's we're not actually serious about peace or development in these places. Iran actually kind of is, to some extent, or at least more serious than we are. That's for sure. In the UAE and Saudi, you have oil money. In Africa, you don't. That's a key point. But that doesn't stop the UAE and Saudi Arabia from having rooting interests in all of these conflicts. I've been reading more and more about Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti. I'm not Djibouti. Who cares about Djibouti? Somalia, and it's really striking that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are there. Less seriously as you get into the Sahel, because why the hell would they care? But they have rooting interests in all the politics, the political entities of the Horn of Africa. And as they've shown, they were deeply involved as far afield as Libya. There's no reason not to expect them to get seriously involved in Ethiopia. So yeah. More Freedom Foundation. Is there hope for a greater Somalia? I don't want there to be a greater Somalia. I'm a pretty. So apparently the Somalis are very. For those who may not know, I think the Somalis are the third or fourth biggest group in Ethiopia. This sort of Somali ethnicity. Something that isn't really focused on very much is that Ethiopia was the successful resistor against imperialism, but was also a bit of an empire itself. And in the 19th century, carved off bits of, traditionally Somali territory, like the whole, like Ethiopia is sort of this sort of ball, and then a whoop, like that whole whoop, that's sort of traditionally Somali territory. There was a big nasty war fought between Ethiopia and Somalia in. I think at Somalia started a big nasty war in the 70s, the Ogaden War, to attempt to take that. Somalia lost, and I think that was sort of where I don't think Somalia's disintegration happened until another decade later, but that was certainly a big factor in Somalia's disintegration, was losing that war to take back Ethiopia, take back the chunks of Somalia that were in Ethiopia. I think revising borders is bad. At no point have I seen Czech Republic and Slovakia, successfully split without problems. But most often, especially in poorer countries, splitting up and screwing with borders just leads to horror. I think the Islamic State was an example of that. I think South Sudan was an example of that. It's funny because one of the sort of more heroic figures of South Sudanese leadership, was it John Garang, or was his name? Didn't want Sudan to split up, just wanted South Sudan to have more power in the Sudanese polity. And then he died, and his lieutenants went for independence, which is, of course, more viscerally appealing. And now, 500,000 South Sudanese have died since? I don't think revising the borders in the Horn of Africa will be good for anybody. Unfortunately, I think it's very likely. Eritrea was the other rah-rah independence thing that we were supposed to celebrate in the 90s, and it turned into one of the grimmest, the African North Korea, they call it, one of the grimmest countries on the planet. One thing that's very disturbing, it's exciting that Abiy Ahmed's attempt to crush Tigray failed. That's a good thing, because I think it's pretty clear at this point that he and the Eritreans he was allied with were using genocidal tactics. It's good that he lost, but now it's a serious question. Well, is Tigray going to become independent? If Tigray becomes independent, well, then yeah, I'd expect other folks to, maybe the Somalis will try to become independent from Ethiopia again. And that sounds, that certainly fits with the national aspirations of the Somali people, but I think it also has a serious potential of what's the word? Horrific conflagration, like Congo style, millions of people dead. And I don't want that. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, actually, I guess there probably are higher hopes for a greater Somalia for carving up Ethiopia now that the Ethiopian government has lost so many troops in the Tigray province that they were trying to crush. But that's not something for me to be happy about. Oh, and as Matt Ellman pointed out, proud Minecrafter is so there is no hope for united Somalia, because that's true. There's also Somaliland, which is a independent a part of Somalia that has broken away, and I don't think it's recognized by much of anybody, but has been sort of de facto independent for 30 years and is largely seen to be better run than the rest of Somalia, or really the rest of the Horn of Africa at this point. More Freedom Foundation. How does the current and previous administration policies compare in relation to Yemen, and why is the U.S. so interested in Yemen? See, that's the screwed up thing, Muslim, which I talked about in this presentation. Maybe I should have said more explicitly, is that as of today, as of July 2021, 6 months into the Biden administration, there is no difference between the Biden administration and Trump administration's treatment of Yemen. And as I said, the U.S. government's main interest in Yemen, it was initially to placate the Saudis after the Iran nuclear deal. But now at this point, it's mostly just making money, because U.S. defense companies are making a ton of money off of this conflict. That's why they're doing it. Matt Ellman points out, we probably need Iran as an excuse to keep the MIC money pumping. That's very true. More Freedom Foundation says this is a very good point. There's a small microscopic optimistic side of me hoping this is for a return to the Iran deal. Am I naive? Maybe. I mean, that's certainly I think I've actually seen that justification made. I don't know if it's by administration figures, but certainly people are making excuses for the Biden administration. The reason the U.S. allowed the Saudi invasion of Yemen to happen was because of the Iran nuclear deal, and because Saudi Arabia was angry that we had made a deal with Iran. Is it possible that the Biden administration is continuing to let Saudi Arabia run in the hopes of getting more Saudi sign-on for the Iran nuclear deal? Maybe. Yeah, okay, that's possible. But why the hell, 6 months in, are we still trying to get yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's possible. That's an optimistic interpretation. That's an interpretation I was cool with 6 months ago, but it's 6 months in. Yemen can't wait, as the hashtag goes. So yeah, I mean, yeah, that could still be true. I'd love it if that were true. Like, if we get the JCPOA next week, will I be less angry about Yemen? Yes, actually. If we re-enter the JCPOA and things just start beginning to calm down in the region generally, I will be less angry about Yemen than I am today, because allowing tensions to go down does make it more likely that there would be a peaceful solution in Yemen. So, because I mean, to some extent, the Saudis do want out of Yemen at this point. They acknowledge that they're wasting an extraordinary amount of money, but the Saudi government can't just run away because they've invested a lot of prestige in it. So they want some kind of advantageous deal. And yeah, if in the context of an Iran nuclear deal that's up and running, then yeah, maybe Yemen peace becomes more viable. But we've also been waiting on the Iran nuclear deal for 6 months now, which is something that really all they had to do was say, we're back in it. They've got a deal that functions. Anyway. Proud Minecrafter says, local cool extreme. Nope, they elected a hardliner. They did elect a hardliner, but there's some arguments, which I think could be true, that a hardliner would actually have an easier time getting back into the Iran nuclear deal than another moderate like Rouhani could have, because he doesn't have pushback from hardliners in Iran because he's a hardliner. Sort of a Nixon going to China kind of vibe. Scott Logs, super chat. Thank you so much. The Saudis have stopped supporting the Sunnis in Lebanon, and Hezbollah is dominant. Comment on the Saudis pulling out of Lebanon. Are we talking about a recent development? I think that the Saudis, man, Lebanese politics is, I'm sorry, Scott, Lebanese politics is, it's like 7 million people, and it seems like 7 million political parties. I think the dynamic you're talking about was some more Sunni Muslim factions were probably too willing to work with Hezbollah for Saudi. And you can either say that as they were willing to work with Hezbollah because they wanted consensus and Lebanon to move forward, or they were willing to work with Hezbollah because they were intimidated and, Iran has too much power or what have you. But I think if you're talking about the same thing that I vaguely recall reading about, the Saudis pulled money because the Sunni factions were working too closely with Hezbollah, which you kind of have to, because Hezbollah is like probably one of the more serious, certainly the most serious military and one of the more serious political actors in Lebanon. However, Lebanese politics, it's a really great question. What's happening in Lebanon right now is horrible. There were a lot of factors that allowed, while Lebanon was a place that always experienced extraordinary poverty in refugee camps, it was also a place of, at the same time, of extraordinary wealth, both because the Lebanese have a very large and wealthy diaspora. Like, I think for years, the richest guy in Mexico was a Lebanese. Lebanese diaspora, just really, really fun people, very attractive women. Anyway, just great people, rich people, wealthy people. Lebanese diaspora, but also the Gulf states would use Lebanon for banking purposes. And I think because of some things that the Lebanese central bank did, some really insane things that the Lebanese central bank did, and a number of other things, this whole thing has fallen apart in Lebanon. So what used to, you'd have extreme poverty and refugee camps, and then extreme wealth and beautiful parties and nightlife and what have you. The whole basis of that weird society that Lebanon has been scooped out, the diaspora and government and Gulfy money, and it's an ongoing horrific catastrophe that I haven't had the energy to cover. But Scott, thank you for highlighting that. I don't have detailed response to that question on the Sunnis pulling out. I mean, Hezbollah has been probably the most important political factor in Lebanon. That might overstate it, but certainly a large political factor in Lebanon for quite some time. I hope that was helpful at all. Joined late. We'll watch later tonight. Always appreciate Rob's insight. Thanks. Well, thank you, Christopher Murtaugh. That's great. You have a question? That's a very generous super chat. So I want to answer your questions. Have you got one? Seems like Lebanese government supports Hezbollah. Tyler Bazinski says it seems like the Lebanese government supports Hezbollah. Well, sure, but that's also because the Lebanese government. That's because Hezbollah better at defending Lebanon from Israel than the Lebanese government is. So yeah, there's a lot of complexity there. Lebanon had Matt Ellman points out, and I think that the key thing here is past tense. Lebanon had a pretty solid middle class, one of the few MENA countries to achieve that. The extent to which that is still the case is very debatable, or maybe not really debatable, in that, like, it just doesn't exist, or it's in the process of being dismantled. Like, there's a lot of people who talk about sort of financial crises, or even, in the crypto community, people who, seem to advocate for financial crises and the death of the dollar or what have you. If you want to see what really happens when a central bank loses control of its currency and a government loses control of its own money, look to Lebanon. That's what happens, and it's not good. So. Yeah, Scott Lux says, yes, my Lebanese friend tells me Hezbollah has veto power over everything. That sort of makes sense. Galaxy MW says, do you think that the money printed in 2020 will backfire in the future? That is a huge, huge question that I feel like there's certainly in every one of the patrons only live chats that I do once a month. And you should all sign up for Patreon. There's a link in the description if you haven't yet. I feel like there's always a 20-minute stint on talking about inflation. I don't know, man. I just don't know. I think there's a lot of folks on musically. There's a lot of folks on like TikTok and in the crypto community talking about, oh, look at all this money that's being printed and inflation. It's gonna, we're definitely gonna end up with hyperinflation and we're in trouble. And that's what a lot of serious economists were saying 12 years ago. During the stimulus to get out of the first 2008 global financial crisis. That's not what happened. The U.S. government has continued to print money. The Fed has continued to be involved in ongoing quantitative easing, which is basically just asset purchases. Buying a lot of the securities it puts out itself. Wait, is it the Fed that puts out the securities or the Treasury Department puts out the securities? I haven't looked at it, so I can't talk about it intelligently. But certainly buying the U.S. government's own assets, other people's assets, to keep things afloat. It's very clear that you cross a certain point, you're instantly going to hyperinflation. That argument is very clearly wrong, has been proven wrong. Repeatedly. A lot of people go completely in the other direction saying, oh, there's no limit to how much money the U.S. government can print. I don't think that's true either. But I don't know, I think is the only answer I have to that inflation question. The Biden administration is now pushing social media companies to curb fake news on vaccines. Is this a problem? That whole controversy, people have been really talking about that a lot this past week. Biden and my fellow, the woman who graduated from my high school, I think, Jen Psaki, the White House correspondent, or what's the press secretary? That's the name. Talking about how Facebook should be banning things or what have you. Well, the president and, Psaki can say whatever the fuck they want. The actual legal and regulatory basis of something like that has not happened. Does that sort of thing intimidate Facebook and Google and YouTube? Absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons this channel has sort of fallen in its ability to pick up new supporters. Is because YouTube quite consciously doesn't allow independent media sources to do particularly well under the algorithm anymore. To be clear, I'm not like resentful or angry at YouTube. YouTube makes its business decisions. And their business decisions did not help the success of my project. That certainly, presidents shouldn't be pro-censorship or whatever, but it's not like, you listen to Fox News right now. It's like, oh, we're living in those Gestapo times. It's like, no, man, like they just made suggestions that will or won't be followed. So I'm not that like freaked out about it. Multimeyer, while the European left is questioning its relations to Islamist groups and gets more critical to structures like Hamas, the American discourse got more pro-Palestine. Any thoughts about that? Yeah, it just doesn't matter for us. None of the Middle East matters for us, and none of the it just doesn't matter for us. I think that we have a much more decentralized polity. I think that we've done a much better job of providing a ladder for the Muslim migration we do have towards success. The U.S. political model is very heavily oriented towards freedom of religion and keeping religion out of government, whereas in Europe, it's not that straightforward. Europe is right next to the Middle East, so actually has to heavily, has to be more involved in those issues. I think the United States has basically just moved on to caring about China. And as I've put in a number of videos, I think the Abraham Accords sort of backfired for Israel in that, before the Abraham Accords, every Palestinian throwing a rock was a representative of 400 million Arabs that hated them. Well, now Israel's got, peace agreements or normalization agreements with most, certainly, I think at this point, if you get Egypt plus Sudan plus, I guess just Egypt, Egypt plus Sudan plus Jordan, that's kind of the majority of Arabs, or at least the majority of close by Arabs, anyway. I think in the U.S., one of the aspects of having more happy, successful Arab and Muslim migration is that we don't have as many marginalized, sort of poor, likely to be radicalized Muslims. We have wealthy Muslims, wealthy Arabs who've been very successful in the U.S. context, who are moving closer to centers of power. Certainly not as quickly as, say, Indian Americans, though many Indian Americans are of Muslim extraction. Was it Hassan Minhaj is a famous example. The guy who had that much lamented, really great sort of John Oliver style show on Netflix. It was one of my favorite of the bunch, but it's been canceled. It was a Patriot Act, or was that what it's called? You've got, that's one of the, I think that's an interesting thing, an interesting dynamic, and why the U.S. public is becoming more sensitive towards Palestinians, because the United States, it sort of actually has incorporated the smaller number of Muslim immigrants that we have, whereas in Europe, they're sort of more marginalized. So we actually have folks of Muslim and Arab extraction who make decisions in media organizations now, whereas I think there's less of that in a lot of Europe. And I think Europe is just sort of generally, in a lot of ways, I think the success of openly Eurosceptic racist parties might have been oversold, but I think in the crushing of parties like the AFD or, actually in France, I think Marine Le Pen's looking pretty good now, right? But in efforts to knock them down, the mainstream European politics have become more sort of right-wing, anti-Islam. That's just, how things are working. I hope that was helpful. Good. I hope that was a good response, Malta. Brando Commando, the Pax Americana is ahistorical in the fact that it protected the territorial integrity of sovereign countries for 70 years, a post-Westphalian order, if you will. Will our alliance with Saudi Arabia and Israel lead to its collapse? That's a very good question, Brando Commando. I think that's one of the really fundamental things that is a sign that the U.S. involvement in the Middle East has gone really, really wrong. We've been tremendously important in the politics of the Middle East since the 1940s, if not before, and more so in the 1960s, when I think 1968, when the British finally pulled out of east of Suez. But it was really our heavy-duty military involvement in the Middle East started to defend this sort of post-Westphalian order that Brando Commando was talking about. We got in there to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, a country they had just invaded. Now we are supporting Saudi Arabia and the UAE's efforts to invade and carve up their poorer neighbor. Something has gone very, very wrong. Yes, I 100% agree that the United States is, in supporting Saudi Arabia, is now acting against the principles of sort of established borders. And that's a very stupid thing to do. It's less of a stupid thing to do for the United States as it is for Russia. I mean, Russia is insane in its whether or not the folks in Crimea wanted to rejoin Russia, which I think is actually, I mean, it doesn't seem like that open a question. Probably the majority of Russians, majority of people in Crimea did want to rejoin Russia. Whether they still feel that way now is a more open question. But that was a really crazy thing for Russia to do, because Russia is a fundamentally pretty weak country for the size of its borders, and it has, especially with a burgeoning China below it, has a very strong interest in this sort of post-Westphalian order you're talking about. Do we know what we're talking? So Brando Commando is referring, I believe, it's the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which was settled the 30 Years' War in Europe. It was not the originator of the concept of, was it cuius elegio, cuius religio? No, that's, I'm not going to, there's a Latin phrase that basically, from a religious context, really established the idea that the leader and people of a given, certainly at that point in 1648, the leadership of a given territory had the right to choose the religion and the aspects of that territory, which is seen by many as sort of the birth of the modern nation state, or at least it was when I was in college. I have some sense that you just don't hear about that as much anymore. The Treaty of Westphalia and the Westphalian Order. So I don't know. So I think respect for borders is it's not really a post-Westphalian order. It's sort of a neo-Westphalian, right? So anyway, that's what Brando Commando is talking about there. So yeah, I think it is. There's something sick and wrong and stupid for the United States to be encouraging the erasure of borders, the carving up of Yemen. I think it's a really, really bad idea. I think that is a lot of the tension. Another example would be in order to get Israel in order to get Morocco to sign an Abraham Accord with Israel, the Trump administration threw out a 50 years standing complaint about Morocco's taking of the vast majority of the old territory of Spanish Sahara, the Western Sahara. The Trump administration acknowledged that, which of 50 years standing was something that the U.S. did not acknowledge because it was seen as unsettling the sort of order or what have you. And I believe the Biden administration is not going to renege on that, is going to continue to have Morocco that. So that's another example. And of course, Israel's taking of, I think it's, I don't know, it's a little suspect to me to include Israel Palestine in that, like, I mean, this is literally borders that were sort of set in the 1940s, and of course the occupied territories post 1967. So I guess it does fit into this context that now certainly the Trump administration was playing around with, and I don't know if we'll see the Biden administration, but certainly the next Republican administration will continue to play around with allowing Israel to annex these territories that were taken in 1967 in violation of that Westphalian order. I think you're absolutely right, Brando Commando. I think that we are playing with fire here. Not fire that's going to impact the United States, of course, but fire that has a distinct chance of really negatively impacting Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and actually, honestly, and if you think about Burma, potentially Southeast Asia as well. It's a really bad thing that we're basically doing just for the benefit of U.S. defense companies. Nobody else's benefit. It's just blood and suffering, and less people to buy things that the other 95% of the U.S. economy produces. That's just dumb. It's sad and pointless. Christopher Murtaugh, we've got a lot of work to make social media function well with our innate moral psychology. Wow. We're not wired to behave as well with abstract people that we are with humans right in front of us. I think it's an interesting point. Yeah. Is this sort of a broader question about whether the internet has been good for us or what have you? I think one of the things about social media is just like, it's not made things worse. I don't think it's just made us more aware of what people actually think, what other people actually think. That's always been something that, and I almost wonder if now that we actually have a clearer picture of the way that a lot of people see the world, does that mean that the chances for education actually become higher? I mean, it's sort of the internet in the context of U.S. politics. The internet has had some really negative effects. Like I don't think Donald Trump would have been president without Facebook or without just the internet more broadly, the ability to get past gatekeepers. Like the Republican Party wasn't going to give Donald Trump an opportunity to get his message out there, but Twitter did. That's a bad effect. But I think positive effects are like marijuana legalization. Like I think like that was just sort of common sense for decades that just never got enacted, but enough people were making that argument online. I mean, the first 3 videos on this channel are anti-drug war videos. And that's, at least with marijuana, that is a something that's been won. That was a huge victory that eluded people for 50 years. Gay marriage is something else that would not have been a possibility without the internet, or at least I don't believe would have happened. The change that we saw in people's attitudes, I don't believe that would have happened as quickly without the internet. So yeah, I don't know. Interesting questions. What is your opinion on Imran Khan? I don't understand Pakistani politics, like at all. I just don't. It's like too complicated. I know this is a terrible cop out, but like I have opinions on like Indian and Pakistani politics, but they are so broad based and poorly formed. I get more and more disturbed by Narendra Modi and like what he means for the politics of India and the treatment of Muslim minorities in India. But like I can't speak in any detail as to, I mean, especially the dynamics in Pakistan are just like, you've got the old sort of British parliamentary influence, but like series of dictators and lurches back and forth, and the influence of different, legacies. And isn't Imran Khan, he's a sports hero, but like, and how does China play into it? I don't know, man. I don't have a confirmed opinion on Imran Khan. I've got a pretty confirmed opinion on Modi, but neither of those opinions are supported particularly well. So I don't think I can really speak to it. What do you make of the Pegasus situation? I have no idea what you're talking about. What is the Pegasus situation? I feel like I saw something about that. What was the Pegasus situation? I'm just going to Google that right now because I feel like I have some vague sense of what that is. Oh, Pegasus. Yeah, that shit's crazy. So the Pegasus situation is Pegasus is a spyware developed by the Israeli cyber arms firm NSO Group that can be covertly installed in mobile phones running most versions of iOS and Android. 2021 Project Pegasus revelations suggests that current Pegasus software is able to exploit all recent iOS versions up to iOS 14.6. Yeah, man, that's some crazy. So basically, it seems like Israel's got like a mini version of the Snowden revelations going on right now. Apparently, they've been spying on like journalists worldwide, which is pretty screwed up, and a whole bunch of other political figures and whatnot. I can't say that I find this particularly surprising. And I have the sense that it's probably going to be a brief intervention in our news cycle. I don't think it's going to. This was a problem with me with the Snowden revelations as well. Was delighted that they became a big thing, that people became more suspicious of the U.S. government and their spying on people. I think spying is bad. I think privacy is good. I'm just never very surprised by these revelations, honestly. It's funny because I have very little respect for the CIA and the U.S. intelligence community more broadly. I don't think it has really the capacity to do many things. But when all of us volunteered to put all our private information on these phones, these little computers that we carry with us all the time, it seemed pretty straightforward to me that the government would always have access to all of it. That just struck me as pretty obvious. I think, I think it's a well-known approach or story that the U.S. government tends to be too, what's the word? U.S. government intelligence is now too reliant on signals intelligence over human intelligence, basically because we have the ability to get it in everybody's phones. We just do that instead of actually trying to understand why people are doing things. So we just have this massive information. And I'd always sort of, when the Snowden revelations came out, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. That's not particularly surprising. And it is not particularly surprising to me that Israel maintains an adversarial spying relationship with journalists all over the world, because Israel is probably more invested than most countries in attempting to control a narrative to cover up nasty shit they do. So, yeah. But it is fascinating, just like Israel spies on everybody. Galaxy MW says Hassan was canceled by Netflix because he spoke the truth. Honestly, I wouldn't be too surprised if, there's probably, you might not be wrong about that. But Netflix cancels a lot of shit. So we shouldn't necessarily run to the most conspiratorial interpretation. Netflix cancels a lot of shit. Europe is way more traditionalist than advertised. I think that's true. I think maybe there was sort of an overcompensation after World War II. This sort of desire to be the instantiation of all that was progressive and better and moving forward, because what had come before was so horrible. And yeah, I think there probably is more of a European rightward lurch for Europeans, especially for folks like me who are in their 40s and looking at what Europe's profile in the world was 20 years ago and what it is today. And I think it's likely that we're going to see further lurches in that direction, honestly. Local Extreme asks, is Iranian democracy dead? Iranian democracy has always been mediated or less is Iranian democracy? I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's always been sort of a controlled democracy, but all sort of democracies are controlled to some degree or another. Is Iranian democracy even less legitimate than it was in prior elections after this past one? Unquestionably. So what happened was the Guardian Council in Iran has always picked and chosen the people who can run. They've always said, oh, you're a little too far out of what we'd accept, and you're not allowed to run. And that was one of many points within the Iranian constitution where the theocratic elite was allowed to sort of carve things down. What happened in this past election, was that in June? Yeah, I think it was just in June, right? With the Guardian Council basically said nobody other than these conservatives we want to win, and a couple guaranteed moderate losers were allowed to run. So it was even more so than normal. Even like very respected members of the Iranian establishment who leaned a little more moderate were and might have had a chance of winning were blocked from running. So Ebrahim Raisi, I probably need to figure out what the appropriate pronunciation of that is. Actually, listen to a news report instead of just reading his name. Ebrahim Raisi is the new president of Iran and was a hardliner and was essentially just given the election. In 2013, Hassan Rouhani, his winning the election was seen as a bit of a shock. And was the result of sort of last-minute moves in the electorate. It was certainly a more authentically democratic-looking result than what we got this June, which could honestly be described, well, without too much hyperbole, be described as sort of more of a coronation than a democratic election. Um, Uh, Lord Rockingham says, I feel like the Peace of Westphalia is kind of overrated. It by no means ended wars of conquest, which arguably only accelerated afterward. I think, Lord Rockingham, you're right, but also the very idea of a nationally delineated sort of borders state is something that was relatively new in the 1640s. Keep in mind that one of the main issues in the 30 Years' War. It's famously the war that killed literally, it was supposedly, we don't have great figures, but killed as many as a quarter or a third of Germany's entire population. It's sort of often described as like the prototype of the evil religious war, because it was certainly Catholics versus Protestants. But what that war was also about was the ability of the Holy Roman Emperor, more Catholic leaning, to assert his power over all the little states and sort of princelets that made up the Holy Roman Emperor at that point. He wanted to crush the Puritan ones, but also over the course of the 30 Years' War, he found at certain intervals that he couldn't rely so much on Catholic rulers. The Bavarians were always famously very Catholic, but also had their own agendas. Were the Saxons? No, I can't remember the Saxons. Anyway, I haven't read a history of the 30 Years' War in some time. But I think what was an issue in the 30 Years' War was just the idea of the independence of a given political unit. So while certainly people in one political unit continued to attempt to crush people in other political units after the Treaty of Westphalia, those political units were seen as more viable and more real things in the centuries after the Peace of Westphalia. So I don't know if I'm making my point, but I've attempted, and there's another super chat. Scott Logs. Thank you, Scott. You've been very generous today. I'm very grateful. Angela Merkel kept me sane during the Trump years. After 16 years, she's leaving in September. Comments on her legacy as a non-Islamophobe. It's fascinating. Still, I have a lot of Republicans in my family, and one guy in particular who just, they know only two, or if they know anything about foreign leaders, they know one or two things. And probably the one thing that, I have a Republican member of my family who'll still talk about, oh, damn, Angela Merkel, she sure fucked up by letting in all those refugees in 2015, which was certainly the narrative in 2015. But in the years since, as Germany has done, I think, a fairly good job of assimilating those refugees, and as everybody in Europe is waking up to the fact that, their entire workforce is retiring, and Germany's got 1 million more young men to work, I think people are waking up to what an absolute triumph that was. It's also worth pointing out that this tremendously horrible thing that Merkel did, that was supposedly going to end her political career and legacy, happened in 2015, like 6 years ago, and she's still the chancellor of Germany. I think Merkel's legacy will be tremendously positive. She's really, it's interesting, there's a lot of anti-German stuff in U.S. Geopolitical discourse now, because they're not helping us isolate the Russians, and they're not helping us do this Cold War against the Chinese, which is of course deeply hypocritical, because in both cases, we in the United States are buying a lot of oil and gas from Russia because it's of a type that's useful to us and available. We in the United States are doing a lot of trade and continued business relations with China, and are complaining that Germany is as well. Angela Merkel has been fantastic in a lot of ways. I don't know, Malta could, Malta could maybe agree that maybe Malta or other Germans could maybe disagree. But Maltamari says Europe is deeply conservative. Most Americans don't realize that because we usually don't burn gays in the street. This is kind of funny. What was I going to say? Angela Merkel, yeah, she was great. But oh God, is it time for her to go? It's crazy how long she's been in power. I guess Germany does have a tradition of having democratically elected leaders that stay for decades. I don't know. It seems too long to me. I feel like there are other competent Germans. Merkel's done a phenomenal job, and I feel like she's supposedly been on her last legs for quite some time. Like, yeah, the 2015 refugee thing was supposedly gonna, that was it for Merkel. That was like apparently, only 2/3 of the way through her time in power, which is just insane to me. But anyway. Wow. We got questions. Dan T, as a German, I think it is amazing how she is respected, not agreed with maybe, but respected across the board. I think that's very true. Ex-Stasi informant. Yes, indeed, she is respected across the world. So have we got questions? We've got a lot of discussion of German politics that I'm not as up on as I perhaps should be. Say Maltman, Angela Merkel. Do we have no more questions? I mean, if we have no more questions, I guess we could end early. That seems wrong. California provided food for all its students. This is so aggressive thing. Okay, that's some conversation. I'm not okay. More freedom. DNT. Referring to your video of how the zeitgeist dictates leaders, and we are in the era of Reagan, end of Reagan. What do you think is the next one? Considering weed and gay marriage are one. I don't know that weed and gay marriage are particularly important for the. Well, I mean, actually, weed in particular has proven to be insanely important for the political economy of the country. I just spent about a month in northern Michigan, where my family has a place, and it's just fascinating. Every little podunk town seems to have a Dollar General, which is a chain of. So where I go for as much of the summer as I can is in northern Michigan, where you have these lakes. They're beautiful, some of those beautiful places on the planet, and there are a lot of people like me who are sort of upper middle class. Or the descendants of upper middle class folk who have spots on these lakes, and then everywhere in between these lakes in northern Michigan are somewhat economically deprived places. With a Dollar General, is a chain of dollar stores, sort of grocery and everything stores that are very budget priced. And usually, if you are in a neighborhood with this Dollar General, it's not a particularly economically vibrant area. So now it seems like all the towns in northern Michigan that aren't on lakes have a Dollar General and a marijuana dispensary, like a nice new marijuana dispensary. People are talking about how they can't find people to work their service jobs because they'd rather work the marijuana dispensary jobs, which are better. It is kind of fascinating. So yeah, I don't want to say it doesn't have a political, economic impact, things like marijuana legalization. But yeah, as for what's next, I think there's a lot of people talking about, this is, to be clear, I've said in multiple videos, there was an FDR era, sort of going from the 30s to 1980, and then there was the Reagan era going from 1980 until today, basically, with sort of Trump and Carter being the tail end of each of those eras. So what are we doing now? I think a lot of people are invested in this idea that we're going to jump back to FDR. And there's a lot of people writing about how, Biden is the new FDR or what have you. And I don't know, maybe we're just going to do World War III. I don't know. I think there are a lot of people who want to say they know what's coming next. I don't. I think in some aspects of what we're doing are going to probably tilt a little more to the left in terms of the amount of spending the government is going to do. But I think I'm also seeing a tilt, it's not in the context of right or left. I'm seeing like sort of a new Victorian era in a lot of ways, where where sure you can be gay, you can be this, that, and the other thing, or what have you, but most of what we understood as dating in the '80s is rape. I think we're sorry, I'm sounding aggressively men's rights there. No, but I think it's like a good thing. I think we're potentially seeing the pendulum swing socially sort of away from sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that's not a bad thing. While we're seeing, maybe we'll see more economic leftism. It's all very up in the air. The Republicans, who for most of my adult life have been the moral majority and all about attempting to be more Christian, are now the party of like Donald Trump and what's the Barstool Sports or whatever. Let me watch my porn in peace types. So yeah, everything's very up in the air, and I just don't know where it's going to land. And I'd love to know. Christopher Murtaugh says, have you read Doug Saunders' The Myth of the Muslim Tide? Curious to hear your thoughts on the book. If you have, probably a different video topic. I have not heard of The Myth of the Muslim Tide, but I will Google that right now. Thank you for that super chat. I wish I could give a better answer than I will Google that right now. The Myth of the Muslim Tide, Immigrants Threaten the West. Sounds fascinating. I should look into that. I can already tell I'll probably agree with the thesis, but that does sound like an interesting book. Can't WA plug the Pegasus spyware loophole? You mean Microsoft? Wasn't that sort of what it was involved with? I don't know. It's probably stuff the NSA uses themselves. So a lot of discussion of the Pegasus stuff that the Israeli hacking scandal that I'm not really competent to speak about. FDR, Galaxy MW says, Biden, the new FDR, LMAO, funniest thing I've ever heard. Yeah, but a lot of people are pushing it. And I think you can actually make an argument that some of the spending that Biden has been able to do is potentially transformative, is on a scale, not just on a scale, because the Republicans have been spending on a disgustingly massive scale for decades now, but the fact that some of Biden's spending is meant to be doing transformative social program stuff, that is a little FDR-ish. I think the idea that he has the mandate for this, the idea that he is going to be able to hold together a governing coalition for more than 2 years, meaning enough power in the Congress to really do anything, seems hard to credit, and I think a little LMFAO, as you put it. Brandon Commander says, thoughts on what's going on in Cuba and Haiti, as well as Japan and the Philippines committing to defend Taiwan if it's attacked. Did Japan and the Philippines really commit to defending Taiwan if it's attacked? So those are very separate issues. My thoughts on Haiti is, my understanding is that Haiti has been in a period of extraordinary ferment for years, for months at least, if not years, before the assassination of the president. Was it last week or the week before? Really extraordinary thing. A bunch of mercenaries out of Miami, it seems like, went, took a contract to go murder a president in the Caribbean. It's another thing that, seems very new and destabilizing, but also seems very old and destabilizing in an equally horrific way. It's a very 19th century sort of thing. A bunch of Americans getting together to go try and take over a Caribbean nation. I think Haiti is just profoundly sad. I think we should basically let any Haitian who wants to move here. There's 7 million of them. A couple million have moved here, get decent jobs, start sending reparations back. The last thing they need down there is another U.S. military intervention. It's just, it's a lot of, I think Noah Smith just put out an article just like, why, how did Haiti fail so miserably with the Dominican Republic right next door, sharing an island, the island of Hispaniola, with Haiti? I'm excited to read that article. Cuba is interesting. It's so frustrating following Cuba on Twitter because everybody has a right or left wing opinion on Cuba, and they're much more interested in putting forward that opinion than actually talking about how, efforts might be made to help the Cuban people or not help the Cuban people. Everyone wants to defend, lefties want to defend the Cuban government, righties want to celebrate a protest movement that may or may not have any real significance. So it's kind of hard for me to understand what's going on in Cuba because everybody's approach to it is so ideologically strong. I come from the standpoint where, yeah, I think that Cuba is run by a dictatorship, and it'd be nice if that dictatorship fell. But I'd like that dictatorship to fall without the kind of horrors that U.S. intervention would impose on it, or the frankly kind of disgusting Miami Cuban diaspora would want to impose on it. I think you've got a bunch of folks, who at this point were dispossessed 60 years ago, who want to go back and start running Cuba as if Batista were back, and I don't find them very attractive either. And I think that too much of U.S. policy towards Cuba is in thrall to those folks. Not that I want the dictatorship in Cuba to continue. It's just I just think that the politics around it are pretty stupid. So I think the worst possible way to confront China is to throw out strategic ambiguity over Taiwan. I think I made that case at some length in a piece that I wrote last week. That you can just click on last week's video. It's the last video before this, and then there's a link to a 5,000 word Medium piece where I talked about confronting China to some degree may be what's next, what has to happen, or at least what we've been forced to do by assholes in Washington, D.C. and Beijing. But the idea that we're going to throw out strategic ambiguity, this will the U.S. defend Taiwan or won't it thing that is pretty key to, it's like the underpinning of almost all economic development in Asia, in East Asia for the past 50 years, that we're just going to throw that out. And that's our big plan for confronting China, is basically like forcing World War III on them. I don't think it's a guaranteed World War III if the U.S. and Japan and the Philippines decided to force Taiwanese independence. I think it's 50-50. It's like 50-50 World War III. And I think it's just dumb. I just don't think that's the right way to go about confronting China. I think it's dangerous and stupid. But that is apparently what we're doing. Did Japan and the Philippines really commit to defending Taiwan if it's attacked? Or was that I would imagine it was more caveated than that, but maybe we're already to the point where it's not. Yeah, Shivam Tawani says the Foreign Affairs article claims that China would invade Taiwan by 2027. What's interesting is I'm reading that. I have that Foreign Affairs right here. And yeah, Foreign Affairs is it is like the Bible of U.S. foreign policy, and it's actually pretty cheap to subscribe to. It's something like $20 a year or something like that. And unfortunately, let's see, is there a drone ad? Usually there's a drone ad. No, it's an oil company ad, actually. The Council on Foreign Relations is tremendously important and influential in U.S. foreign policy. Wow, that's interesting. No, it's not. Anyway, so there is an article in this edition of Foreign Affairs that says that China's going to invade Taiwan by 2027. There are 4 other articles, and keep in mind, this is like the baseline war hawk U.S. establishment. 4 other articles in this Foreign Affairs things. Yeah, let's say that's probably not going to happen. So you have to understand there are, even within the sort of baseline hawkish Washington, D.C. establishment, there are more and less responsible actors. The American Enterprise Institute, which is, I think, the most recent home of I believe it was a woman who wrote the article you're talking about, is like the insane war hawk people. Like they're like the people who take money from the less respectable defense contractors. Not like the Boeings. They're down to like, the slime balls that make the bullets or whatever. So foreign affairs, unfortunately, will give space to deranged war hawks, the deranged war hawks of the American Enterprise Institute. But that doesn't mean the rest of us should take it seriously. I think specifically, was it Noah Smith is just an absolute guy, knows more about economics, has forgotten more about economics than I will ever know. But when it comes to geopolitics, he's just an absolute fucking babe in the woods and has no idea what he's talking about. And yeah, he built a very alarmist article about China's intentions towards Taiwan off of that foreign affairs article that was like basically like sub Halliburton propaganda, which is a sign that he's out of his element and should probably shut the fuck up when it comes to issues of geopolitics, because he has no idea what he's talking about. Anyway, so yeah, I'm tired. We've now been doing this for 2 hours. I'm going to start spieling unless there is a super chat. I will definitely answer questions if there is a super chat. My name is Robert Morris. I'm here at the More Freedom Foundation. Every Tuesday, I do something. I like to do more produced videos more often, which I haven't been doing so much recently because, well, they have to be longer now and they're more difficult to do. And I have lost a little momentum. I don't think I've done a single produced video yet this month, which is, I will rectify by the end of this month. Yeah. Anyway, please subscribe, please like, please comment, please do all of those things. I can be found on Twitter at RoboLaw. That's Twitter at RoboLaw, where the conversation continues all week long. I've now, as a new thing, I only go on Twitter after the sun comes down, which I think makes me more productive and more likely to do produced videos. But yeah, Twitter at RoboLaw. I'm on Instagram at the More Freedom Foundation. I think I'm on TikTok at the More Freedom Foundation as well. Getting a little more consistent with my branding. I have written a number of books. Where did I put them? Oh, no, they're right under here. I've written a number of books that are very helpful for understanding the world. You should check out. We got FATCA and the New Birth of American Empire. It talks a lot about the real things that matter for U.S. power, not this sort of dumb show with the weapons and the tanks and the aircraft carriers, but our sort of legislative and financial power. That's the stuff that really matters. I talk about the U.S.-Saudi relationship and how it's at the root of all sort of the terrorism stuff we used to really care about before we started going after China in a big way. And then I talk about, this is basically my stealth history of the world, avoiding the British Empire, talking about how the U.S. is making a lot of the same mistakes that the British did. You can find all of these books on Amazon, both in the Kindle and in these convenient physical formats. Please check them out. I got a newsletter you can sign up for. Anyway, thank you all for being here. You guys are great. No more super chats? All right. That's cool because I am beat. And I am very grateful for all of you for being here. Thanks so much.